Hey, welcome to the Profit Builder video series. I'm Vicki Suter, your host, and I'm the author of the book, The Profit Bleed, How Managing Margin Can Save Your Contracting Business. And these videos are all about helping you grow a more sustainably successful contracting business. And for over 25 years, I've been helping contractors increase their profits, generate more time in their day, and reclaim and refine the joy in what they do again. And that's what this video series is all about. And my goal is to help give you the thinking to be able to understand how to do that in your business. And then I actually give you tools and resources that help you implement what it is the video is talking about. So I hope you enjoy today's Profit Builder video. Welcome to this next video in the series on planning for profits. Let me just ask you a question. Have you ever had the experience that your revenue has been growing and going up, but your bottom line has not been increasing at the same rate? And it's super frustrating, right? And I've seen this happen with a lot of companies in the many years that I've been working with contractors. And even recently, I had my client, Bob, who called me before our meeting and he goes, okay, I'm sending over all my financials to you and I'm a little freaked out. He said, my revenue is up for the year. We've done a really good job in selling more work, but our bottom line is failing miserably and there's no money in the bank and we just need to figure it out. And I asked him to send me a bunch of reports. So I said, listen, send me your P&L for this year and the last 2 years. So let's take a look at your last 2 years of data, because I knew that in the last 2 years he had been more profitable. And let's take a look at what's changed, because I know your revenue is gone up. And I know that you're doing a much better job in terms of selling, but let's take a look at where it might be. Now, one of the reasons that I always, a lot of times start my meetings with clients of just like, let's look at the data, because numbers always tell a story. And when you can look at the numbers are going to let you see where really is the issue or the problem with the profitability of my business. And you know, one of the things that I say is like, yeah, there's a lot of numbers that show up on there, but there's three primary numbers that are really the drivers for your profitability. So your number one, which most all of us pay attention to, is revenue, right? Sales. Like, what is my revenue? My revenue is certainly a driver. If I'm not selling enough, then I'm not going to be making enough on the bottom line. But oftentimes that's really where people stop looking. That seems to be the primary number they look at. Well, the next really important number to look at is gross profit margin. Contractors live and die by gross profit margin. If your gross profit margin is not consistent, then you're not going to make a consistent profit. And by the way, I want to define this term, gross profit margin. Gross profit is the difference between your revenue and what it cost you to produce that revenue. So the difference between your revenue and your cost of goods sold is your gross profit dollars. And gross profit margin is that percentage of that rate of return that you're getting. So margin by definition simply means percentage. And so managing by a percentage, what it does is percentages are what I call the great equalizer. In other words, revenue can go up and go down, but your margin should stay consistent. And you want to have a goal, and I talked a little bit about this in the last video, that you want to have a goal for your gross profit margin that you're managing against in all of the projects as you're bidding and when you're sending them out. Make sure that you have a gross profit margin goal for what you're going for, and that you want to look at that number year over year and see, am I being consistent in it? So we've got revenue, gross profit margin, that's a second key number. And then the third key number is your overhead expenses. So one of those three things, as Bob and I started to look at his numbers, it was going to be, we knew one of those three things. It was either going to be his revenue number, his gross profit margin, or his overhead that was depleting his bottom line. And so as we sat down, we looked at all 3 years together. And, you know, at first Bob came in and he was like kind of defensive, right? He goes, hey, I've been working my butt off. We are so busy all the time. I know revenue is not the problem. Look, it looks like I can see that it's gone up year over year. And, I acknowledge that that was true, right? So Bob, about 4 years ago, had this real spike, had done a really large job, and their revenue was a couple million ahead, had dropped down the next year. And over the last 3 years has actually increased year over year, anywhere between 500,000 and a million a year. So he was doing really well in terms of growing revenue. So I said, yeah, I totally get that. Let's look at the numbers though. So as we looked at them side by side. And I had him, as I said, bring, I actually had him bring 4 years worth of data. So I had him bring that really big year. And then I had him bring 3 other years of data, including where he was to date for this year. And as we looked at the numbers, sure enough, the revenue had been steadily increasing. But then we started looking at the gross profit margin. And one of the things that I noticed is the gross profit margin had gone from 30% to 27% and to 25%, and this year was at 24%. That steady decline in gross profit margin was a big factor that was contributing to the bottom line being down. So for you, as you're looking at, if you're asking the question for yourself, all right, so how does this apply to me? And what's causing my bottom line to maybe not stay proportionate with how much my revenue is going up? One of the key numbers that I would recommend that you look at is your gross profit margin. Is your gross profit margin declining year in, year out? And if so, why? So as Bob and I started to dig, and I started to ask more questions and started to evaluate, all right, what are the projects that he's had on the books? I had sent him away and I asked him to actually get some data so that we could look further about what was causing that decline. And when he came back with the data, what we found out was that there were some projects that he had bid that had been missing scope, that they still had to perform the work, but there was scope missing at the beginning of the job. And so they had to eat it, and they had a couple of very large projects that ended up with very low margins. So what are some ways that you can prevent that from happening? Well, one of the things that out of that conversation that happened is that Bob implemented putting in a review process with his estimators and his project managers to make sure that before projects went out, that the scope was verified and checked against the plans. That had not been, that it was sort of done sporadically, hadn't been done consistently. So we started doing that. Now, that wasn't going to do anything about what had been missing for the last couple of years, but what it did at that point is it put something in place so that now go forward, there's a stopgap measure in place that will prevent that from happening in the future. We also, in the process of looking at this, did what I did with Joe when I talked in my last video about, we checked the basis for their pricing, made sure that their labor costs were fully burdened. And we also looked at their markup for overhead and profit, made sure that that was the right numbers for them to be using. So planning for profits begins with making sure that you have the right cost basis for your labor and materials and your subs, but also the right scope of work. And if you want to make sure that you make a consistent profit, you have to plan for it in that way. That one of the things Bob put in place is to make sure that from now on, all of the bids that are done are double checked by management before they go out to make sure that they're within scope, that nothing is missed. And, it's always an interesting thing when I have this conversation with people, because a lot of times people go, I should not have to babysit my estimator. You're right. You shouldn't have to babysit your estimator. So the question that you want to ask yourself is, how do you put in place stopgap measures to make sure that you're not losing profits before bids ever leave your office? And that might mean that the estimator needs more training. It might mean that you need to have a double checklist for a process or a procedure around estimating. It might mean that you do have to just have part of your process be that before bids get finalized and sent out to a client, that there is a checks and balance system in place where somebody else looks at it. For Bob, one of the things that he needed to do was to get his estimator some more training, because his estimator was not understanding how to make sure that all the scope was in place. And also they put into place a checklist. And until those things were, are working better, in the meantime, Bob's going to check all those bids before they actually ever leave his office. So that's one of the things that he saw, that gross profit margin was declining, scope was missing, and then he put a process in place to make sure that that didn't happen in the future. Now, what are some of the other reasons why gross profit margin might drop in your company? Well, it's either that in Bob's case, there was scope missing from the bid that had to be done according to the contract terms, and so that's one thing. The other thing that can happen, obviously, is labor. Labor's our biggest unknown factor that can cost overruns. And then another thing is change orders and change order processes missing or not being in place, or scope of work, work done out of scope where a change order isn't captured, or work done without the change order being signed, right? So those are some other things. And in future videos, I'm going to dig a little bit more into that. And just to say, though, that I think it's important that as we're talking about what are some of the things that drive gross profit margin going down, those are a couple of the other key reasons why margin goes down. So one thing that you might look at is, are you doing job costing and are you checking labor hours every week to make sure that your job cost shows how you're doing compared to your actual budget? So what's your actual compared to your budget, and comparing those two and seeing where are you compared to where your budgeted hours should be. So that's one of the things that you can do right now to start to impact and have more control over your gross profit margin within your company. Bob actually has that practice in place, and so his next action really has more to do with checking it before a bid goes out. Yours might be that you have to look at some of those other things. So then we kept looking at Bob's numbers, though, right? So we knew his revenue is okay. We looked at his gross profit margin and went, okay, that's declining. We put in place that stopgap measure to make sure that now bids would be checked so that scope wouldn't be missed. And then we started looking at his overhead expenses. And as we started to compare year by year, one thing that we noticed is that, like so many companies, for Bob, his company, the largest dollar volume of cost for overhead is labor. And that's true for almost any contractor that I work with. Your largest overhead expense number is your labor, and the second largest one is facilities. And we started looking at, so what we did is we just scanned down on overhead and we said, okay, what are the largest dollar amounts that are spent year by year? And we actually looked at them as a percentage of revenue. And of course, it was labor and facility expense, in particular, their rent, utilities, and that cost. One of the first things that we noticed is that overhead labor had increased in the last 2 years by 20%. And his volume had not gone up by 20%. His volume had gone up by about 5%. So then it begged the question, okay, what's causing overhead labor to have gone up at such a high proportionate rate and that our volume has not gone up that much? Has something changed about the scope of our work that requires more of our administrative labor? Have rates gone up for labor and for the cost of our employees and overhead, and we're not charging out enough in our markup for overhead to jobs? Is it that we have become less efficient in what we're doing? So here's an interesting thing that we noticed for Bob. When we looked back 3 years ago, he had done about $2 million more in volume. Well, it was actually 4 years ago. He had done $2 million more in volume 4 years ago, and he hired all this staff to accommodate for this really big job that he had done that had that spike in revenue. And he kept that overhead staff that was more in relationship to that amount of volume he had done. Volume had then gone down, but he did not reduce that overhead staff. And so that was one of the things that, in looking at the numbers and looking at the data, we started to look at, okay, how many employees do you have? And what's the revenue per employee? We started to dig a little bit deeper and realized he had labor, he had office support staff that was more than what he needed for the amount of volume that he was doing. Now, that's an easy statement to make, but we get kind of used to having people work for us and they become part of the culture. And, nobody sits around, twiddling their thumbs. What happens is human beings, what we want to do is we'll fill the amount of time that we have. So everybody looked like they were really busy, because people want to be busy. They want to feel like they're doing something that's contributing. But what it required at that point is for us to sit down and have a conversation about, all right, what do you really need? How do we right size your overhead staff for the amount of volume that you're doing? And so what it required is coming up with a plan for how do we have some of what that work is that some of those people are doing get absorbed into the rest of the staff? And did we need to maybe outsource some of that, which is ultimately what Bob ended up doing. We came up with a plan for him to outsource some of it and some of his other staff to absorb some of that. We eliminated one entire position, which was going to bring his overhead labor back down to the level that it needed to be. So you want to look for yourself at your overhead costs, and you want to look at them. And the reason we look year by year is because one of the things that I always say is that numbers in and by themselves don't mean anything. Numbers mean something in relationship to something else. So you want to look year by year and compare your years on your profit and loss statement, ideally on one spreadsheet next to each other so it's really obvious. You want to look year by year, look at the dollars as a percentage of revenue. Remember I said percentages are the great equalizer. So when I look at it as a percentage and I see that it had gone up 20%, I'm like, wow, that's significant. And so how do we see the numbers in a way that lets us see the story that the numbers tell? Because numbers always tell a story, but they only tell a story when we can see them in relationship to something else. So one of the things to understand is that numbers in and by themselves don't mean anything. They only mean something in relationship to something else, whether that something else is your goal, your budget, a comparative of another year, a comparative to industry standards. Now that last one's a really tough one, right? But if you have certain standards and goals in your business, and let's say you have a goal of doing $5 million a year in revenue, that's one standard, a comparative that you're doing. Let's say that you have a goal of a 30% gross profit margin, that's another comparative. And you can see when you look at your profit and loss year over year, have I ever done that volume? Have I ever done that amount of gross profit margin? And then the last number is your net profit number. And your net profit number for a well-run company, you want that to be somewhere between 8 and 10%, and a really well-run company between 10 and 12%. Now, I will say when you get into the multi-digits of multi-million-dollar company, if you're 30, 40, $50 million, that number on the bottom line is going to be, that percentage is going to be lower. But if you're running, and when I say 8 to 10% or 10, 12% on the bottom line as a goal number for you, that means after your salary. If you're an owner of the company and you're watching this is after your salary. So if you, as you look at your numbers and you pull out your data, as I did with Bob, and we started looking year by year, you're going to see that the numbers start to tell a story. And even if just the story is, where are my numbers compared to my goals? And where are my numbers compared to prior years? And if my expenses are going up, where are they going up specifically, and what can I do about them? One of the other numbers that Bob noticed was going up for him was in office rent and utilities. Again, in that year when he had a big spike in revenue, they leased more office space. And now all of a sudden he had more office space than he really needs in order to have that much staff. And so we started getting creative about, could he sublet some of that space out until the lease was going to be renewed? Could he go back to his landlord and renegotiate the rent? I will tell you, in years of recessions, I've actually done this. I've had a lot of clients who have done that, who have gone back to their landlords and said, "Hey, can I renegotiate my rent to a lower amount?" Or maybe that landlord, has a different space and would like that new space. One of the things I always say is that unless you ask, you're not going to know, and it never hurts to ask. So if, in that particular situation, Bob did actually try to go back to his landlord, and that was not going to be able to be a solution. The landlord didn't have enough space, other space for him to move into. And and obviously, if you're going to move space, you got to look at the cost benefit analysis of that, right? Sometimes that just doesn't make sense. But one of the things that he is doing is looking at how he might be able to sublease out a couple of the office spaces that he has. So there's different things that you can do. But the first thing is you got to be able to see your numbers, right? When you can see it, then you have that clarity. And when you have that clarity, you have more confidence. And when you have more confidence, you can take more powerful actions. So your ability to take powerful actions is going to be that you want to have that, you'll be able to do that when you have that clarity. And so the thing about having numbers that are, and being able to look at your numbers and compare them and analyze them and ask the question, what's the story they tell? It'll start to open up for you a different seeing about what's impacting the profitability of your business and how can you plan for more profitability. And again, I'll say numbers compared to something have more meaning. That is what gives them their meaning, compared to either your goals or compared to your prior history or compared to industry standards. So when you can look at your numbers based on comparing to goal and comparing to from year to year, you'll be able to start to see a difference in, all right, where are there changes and what can I do about those changes in order to be able to make a consistent revenue, consistent gross profit, and a consistent bottom line. So here's my recommendation to you and my invitation to you is you're planning for more profits in your business. Just start out by looking at where are my results this year compared to the last year and the year before that and the year before that. Look at 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years. I like to look at 5 years worth of data. I always find that it's illuminating to be able to see that span of time and compare information year over year. I do this with a lot with clients, and I have to tell you, there's always something illuminating that shows up when we look at the data in that comparative way. So I invite you to take a look at that for yourself and look at how can I make some changes in my business to plan for helping my business and helping me be more profitable and plan for profits. In my next video, I'm going to talk about sort of the next step of planning for profits that takes it from looking at historical information to how do I plan and move forward in the future for that. So one resource that might be helpful to you as you're doing that analysis year over year is I would encourage you to look at what is your overhead break-even percentage year over year. So as you're looking at that 4 or 5 years worth of data, calculate that information for yourself. Now I'm including here, and there's a link below, a resource that will actually give you the formula for calculating what your overhead break-even percentage is. And just a little key is that it's not the percentage that shows on your profit and loss statement. So a lot of people mistake it as it is, and if you use that percentage, you're going to lose money. guaranteed. That is not your overhead break-even percentage. So make sure to check out the formula. It's super simple to figure out for yourself when you just look at the article that I'm giving you the link for down here. Check it out for yourself. See if that doesn't help illuminate, help you have more clarity so that you have more confidence, so that you can take the next powerful action in planning for the profitability for your business. I'll see you next time. I hope you found today's video helpful. If you're ready to take your next step in your leadership journey and to build a great contracting business, I encourage you to check out my book, The Profit Bleed. It's full of great tools and resources that will help you implement the processes and the systems and the structure that will allow you to build a more profitable business, allow you to work less hours, and help you reclaim the joy and fun in your business and in your life again. And for a limited time, you can get my book for free. All you have to do is pay $7.95 shipping and handling. And you simply need to go to theprofitbleed.com/free. Thanks again for joining me for today, and I look forward to seeing you next time on The Profit Builder.